Welcome back. This is going to be the fifth and final video in this series on the human ego. So I'm going to try and wrap it up and pull it together. If you find this series useful, valuable, please like and subscribe, because subscribing encourages YouTube to circulate this around the world, and I think that's a good thing. In fact, that's the whole point of doing this. So please subscribe. That's the most important thing you can do. Now, as I've said before, and I want to recap, okay? The human ego thinks about four things, chases after four things, chases after money, property, the all-important status, okay, and the empty gratification that it derives from these things. Now, let me pick up this. Okay, the ego chases after those things. The ego thinks about those things 24/7, no matter what it's doing. We might not realize it, but it's true. The more conscious of this we become, the more we'll realize how our lives are dominated by these four meaningless things. Now, we can juxtapose ego against enlightenment, but we can also say true love. True love is something we probably know more about. We can also put it up against the Holy Spirit, okay? Whether it's the Holy Spirit, whether it's true love, whether it's enlightenment, all of those things represent the opposite of ego. Now, true love, we might have had a taste of it in our lives, but if we look at true love in the context of enlightenment, in the context of the Holy Spirit, then we'll get the idea of how it is, in fact, the opposite of the human ego. Now, look at it this way. If true love is my heart, but I don't want to have that, so I take that out and I'm giving it to somebody else, true love would be in the way of my selfish ambition. I take that out, I give it to somebody else. Enlightenment. What is enlightenment? Understanding. Okay, well, you know, it'd be great to have understanding of these higher thoughts, but again, it's standing in the way of what I need to do. So I take out my brain, I give that to somebody else. Okay, well, what is the Holy Spirit? Well, let's say that's my soul. Okay, so, you know, well, I've got to battle in the arena. I have to compete. I have to slay my opponent. I don't have time to worry about my soul. I'm going to take that out and give that to somebody else. So I've taken out my heart, I've taken out my brain, I've taken out my soul. Okay? How am I supposed to function without those three things? I still have the ego, but I am missing my heart, my brain, and my soul. Now, are we trying to go through life without these three things? Do we really think that it doesn't matter to us or to anybody else if we're going through life without our heart, without our mind, without our soul? Is that what we want, or is that something that we have deceived ourselves into thinking is good? Okay, I think we have deceived ourselves very much. I think we are living our lives in the rat race of life, in the competition of life, which the ego thrives on. It tells us that's what it's all about. We're like a rat running on the wheel. That's the rat race. You're running on a wheel, but you never get anywhere. You can work one job, two jobs, three jobs, and it seems like you're never getting ahead. And even if you did get ahead, let's say you're at the top of the office tower, you're making millions of dollars, you're working 80 hours a week, and all you do is work. Yes, you've got money, but you've sacrificed all your relationships. So really, all you have is the ego. You might have a big mansion on top of a hill, but you really don't get to spend time there. You really don't get to enjoy the so-called fruits of your labor. And, well, if you're serving the ego, then what are the fruits of your labor? You've destroyed all your relationships. What is your treasure? What is it that you were trying to achieve? Well, you wanted the big promotions. You wanted the mansion. You wanted the cash in your bank account. So you just work until you die, and you'll have that, and when you die you lose all of that, and you didn't have relationships anyway, so you haven't really lost anything. This is not valuable, okay? Sacrificing all relationships, taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. The ego loves to take pleasure in the misfortune of others because the ego is all about comparison. Now let's not forget, the ego is about separation, enlightenment, love. It's about unity, okay? So if we're separate from everybody else, then the ego looks in terms of comparison. Do I have more than the other person? Now that can be achieved in two ways. One, the other person can have less, or we can have more. This creates that separation, this sense of superiority or inferiority. That's how the ego thinks. Now, based on the ego, if a person was given the choice, okay, you could have twice as much as you do now, but everybody else would have 3 times as much as they do now. Or you could have half as much as you do now, and everybody you know, all your family and friends, they would have nothing at all. You'd have half as much as you do now, but they would have nothing at all. So would you rather have twice as much, knowing that everybody else would have 3 times as much as they do now? Or would you rather have half as much, knowing that your loved ones would have nothing at all? Clearly the ego would choose to have half as much so that everyone else would have nothing at all. That way the comparison, the gap between the self and everybody else, all things being separate, would be the greatest. This is the goal of the ego. The ego really doesn't care about having more. The ego cares about being better than the other person. It's a competition. Anything the ego can do to undercut is of equal value to the ego that elevating one's own status achieves. This is how bad the human ego is. In fact, you could draw an analogy between the ego and what many people would refer to as the devil. I would say we don't need a devil if we have the ego. The devil is supposed to be the great deceiver who gives us bad ideas about how we can undercut everybody else, lie, cheat, steal, abuse, molest, all that stuff. Well, the ego tells us all about that every day. We are such a diabolical species. There is no evil that the ego is not enticed by. The human ego is every bit as bad as everything we could ever accuse some devil of being. If we have an ego, and we all do, then we all have the devil in our lives already. We don't need another devil. We have one every time we look in the mirror. So we have to get rid of the ego. And in the last video I spoke at length in regard how to do that. I spoke about King Solomon, who had it all. He was probably the wealthiest man on record, had hundreds of wives, hundreds of concubines, owned everything. He was a king. He had all these things, and he got bored, and in his old age he looked back on his life, and in his writings you could see he was depressed. He felt that he'd spent his life chasing after nothing. He called it chasing after the wind. And he said that his whole life was just dedicated to a kind of vanity. Like he was trying to prove something. Like he saw others as separate. That having all these things would give him gratification that turned out to be empty. Well, the gratification provided by money, property, status, it's always empty. That's why empty gratification is the 4th thing. Money, property, status, and empty gratification. That's what the ego thinks about 24/7. That's what the ego chases after, and that's the folly of mankind. If we can adopt the idea that we're asleep in heaven, We already have enlightenment, but we're having a nightmare. This world is the nightmare. We created it out of our own psyche. Everything wrong with this world is an attribute from within. And the only way to diffuse that is to forgive absolutely everything, because in doing so, we are forgiving ourselves. Now, this is obviously something that takes years. It's not a light switch, okay? And I will be talking more about the ego in future series, but I had to get it across first because it relates to everything else. I want to do many videos, dozens of videos on all aspects of life, whatever is the most important, but it's always going to relate back to this idea of ego versus enlightenment. And you can call enlightenment true love, you can call it the Holy Spirit, you can call it your friend, because it is. The ego is not. Now, what is real treasure anyway? The ego doesn't know what it is. Real treasure is the true love relationships. The kind of relationship you have, assuming you're a good, healthy person, the relationship you might have with your child. That's a true love relationship. Some people have a true love relationship with God. Some people have a true love relationship with a true friend. Now, if you are walking through life experiencing and giving true love, well, if you believe in reincarnation, you're going way up the ladder faster than anybody else, irregardless of what's in your bank account. You are getting ahead as opposed to others who are working their way down. Okay? If you believe in eternity, then you are building up for yourself treasure in heaven. What's treasure in heaven? Well, that would be true love. We might be only able to have a little bit of true love here in this dream, but if we have treasure in heaven, then we have unlimited true love up there to look forward to, because we've demonstrated that that's what we value. Whatever we value, we're going to gravitate to in the afterlife. If we're all about selfish ambition, if we see the world as an arena and all we can do is cut other people down, if we're willing to sacrifice our own relationships, including our children, our friends, everybody, just to get ahead of them, and if we experience a sense of satisfaction when they're not doing as well as we are, well, I tell you what, we're going to gravitate to that mentality in the afterlife, and I don't think that's something that any of us want. So I want to thank you for watching this series. This was something that needed to be shared before I can share anything else. So thank you very much. There's a lot more to come. I'm going to be producing many videos and many series. My name is Scott McGurn, and thank you very much for your time.